January 1943. London was still burning. The Blitz had ended, but the smoke never really left. Ration lines stretched around corners, and in Whitehall, the men in uniform stared at charts covered in red ink. Ships lost, convoys sunk, tonnage gone. The Atlantic had turned into a graveyard. Every week, German U-boats sank another line of merchant ships. Food, oil, and ammunition, everything Britain needed to stay alive, vanished beneath the waves. The Royal Navy was fighting a war of mathematics, and the numbers were merciless. Steel was gone. Shipyards were at full capacity. The Atlantic convoys were bleeding faster than they could be replaced. It was during this winter, when desperation turned to silence, that a man no one expected walked into the Admiralty with an idea so absurd it bordered on lunacy. His name was Geoffrey Pyke, an inventor, a writer, and to many, a nuisance. He wasn't a soldier or an engineer. He was a civilian who thought in shapes, materials, and paradoxes. And he believed he could solve Britain's greatest naval crisis using ice. Pyke had noticed something no one else had bothered to test. Ice, when frozen under the right pressure, was not fragile. It was resilient, flexible, and if reinforced with sawdust, it could resist impact better than steel. He called it pykrete. To the men at the Admiralty, it sounded like nonsense. But the file he handed them was no joke. Inside were calculations, material tests, and sketches for a floating airfield over 600 meters long. It would serve as a mobile base for bombers, a ship that could not sink, could not burn, and could be built anywhere there was water and cold. The project had one name: Habakkuk, a biblical reference. Be astonished, wonder, for I will do something in your days you would not believe if you were told. That was the idea, and the moment it reached the desk of Lord Louis Mountbatten, head of Combined Operations, it was impossible to ignore. Mountbatten had seen hundreds of absurd proposals since the war began, but this one had the scent of genius buried beneath madness. He ordered a classified meeting. No minutes, no transcripts, no official record. In that cold January morning, under flickering lamps in the Admiralty basement, 3 men stood over Pyke's drawings. One of them finally spoke. "If this works, we can change the Atlantic." The others didn't answer. They simply nodded, because no one wanted to say what they were thinking. If it failed, it would become the greatest embarrassment in British naval history. But in that winter of 1943, failure was already everywhere. So they decided to build a ship of ice. By early 1943, the Atlantic Ocean had turned against its masters. The convoys that once carried life to Britain were now silent stretchers of wreckage, drifting under gray waves. Each week brought new telegrams. Convoy SC-118 lost, 12 ships sunk. The Germans called it Der Tonnagekrieg, the War of Tonnage. Their submarines hunted in packs, striking by night, diving before anyone could strike back. In London, the Admiralty's operations room looked less like a war office and more like a funeral home. Red pins on the Atlantic map marked ships that would never return. There were too many pins, too much red. The Royal Navy was stretched thin. Destroyers meant for patrol duty were escorting merchant convoys instead. Every escort meant one less ship for offensive operations. Every new haul demanded more steel, and there wasn't any left. Britain's steel quotas were already devoured by bomb damage, aircraft production, and tanks for North Africa. By winter, the home fleet had more men than metal. Across the ocean, the United States tried to fill the gap. Liberty ships rolled out of American yards at record pace, but even that wasn't enough. For every 100 tons built, another 100 were sunk. The North Atlantic Gap, a stretch of water between Iceland and Newfoundland, remained a kill zone. too far for fighters from Greenland, too distant for escorts from Britain. There, in those thousands of square miles of dark water, U-boats ruled. Convoys needed eyes in the sky, long-range patrols that could spot periscopes before they struck. But airfields didn't float. Carriers were rare, fragile, and made of the one resource no one could spare: steel. The Admiralty's technical branch began compiling desperate memoranda. Ideas grew stranger each week. A ship built from concrete, floating runways towed behind destroyers, even proposals to freeze seawater into temporary harbors. Most were dismissed within minutes. One line, however, survived every meeting. Requirement: permanent floating base capable of hosting 4 squadrons of Coastal Command aircraft. Construction to use non-strategic materials. The men around the table looked at each other. Non-strategic materials. That ruled out steel, aluminum, copper. That left almost nothing. Almost. Because somewhere in the back of the file, attached to a civilian's name few recognized, was a paper describing something neither solid nor liquid. A material that could, at least on paper, stand where ships drowned. Lord Mountbatten, overseeing combined operations, read the summary twice. Then he read it again. He didn't laugh. He called for a meeting. When his aide asked what the topic would be, Mountbatten's answer was quiet, almost casual. Ice. We're going to talk about ice.
Geoffrey Pyke didn't look like the kind of man who changed wars. He wasn't a soldier, or an engineer, or even a scientist in the traditional sense. He was a thinker, a restless one, and that made him dangerous in the best and worst possible ways. He had worked as a journalist before the war, then as an analyst for the British War Cabinet. He spoke too fast, slept too little, and had a habit of vanishing into silence mid-conversation, lost in whatever calculation had taken root in his mind. To most of Whitehall, Pyke was a nuisance, a civilian dreamer sending impossible memos about impossible weapons. But to Lord Mountbatten, he was something else, a spark. Their paths crossed in late 1942, when combined operations was desperate for unconventional solutions. Mountbatten had already authorized amphibious tanks, floating bridges, and flamethrower barges. When Pyke's letter landed on his desk, titled Proposal for an Unsinkable Floating Airfield, Mountbatten didn't laugh. He invited the man in. Pyke arrived in an overcoat 2 sizes too large, clutching a box of papers and a single block of cloudy ice wrapped in canvas. He dropped it on Mountbatten's desk without a word. The surface of the ice was dull, almost gray, and laced with faint wood fibers. Mountbatten frowned. "What am I looking at?" Pyke's reply was calm, almost mechanical. "A material that floats, resists bullets, and doesn't need steel. It's called pykrete." He explained the principle in his usual rapid, clipped tone. Ordinary ice was brittle, yes, but add just a small amount of sawdust, roughly 14% by mass, and the result was something altogether different. It didn't shatter when struck. It bent. It could even be machined like wood. Mountbatten was intrigued, but skeptical. "You're suggesting we build warships out of this?" Pyke smiled faintly. "Not warships, a fortress, a floating runway for bombers. 1,000 feet long, 200 wide. It won't sink, won't burn, and it can be built wherever it's cold." Mountbatten leaned back. "And where do you plan to build it?" "Canada," Pyke said. "Plenty of space, plenty of cold." The idea was madness, but the kind that thrived in wartime. Britain had run out of conventional options. If the material worked, even partially, it could change everything. Within a week, Mountbatten arranged for a demonstration. He invited a small group of Admiralty officers to a freezing storage facility outside London. When they arrived, Pyke stood beside 2 blocks, one of ordinary ice, the other of his new creation. He handed a revolver to an officer. "Shoot them both," he said. The officer fired into the first block. The bullet shattered it clean through. Then he fired into the second. The bullet vanished with a dull thunk. When they inspected the hole, the ice hadn't cracked. It had flexed, then resealed with frost. Mountbatten laughed out loud. "Good God, it works." Pike didn't smile. He simply said, "Now imagine a ship made of it." A week later, a classified memo crossed the Prime Minister's desk. Winston Churchill's handwriting sprawled across the margin. "Make it happen." From that moment, Project Habakkuk was officially born. Pike was given a small research staff and access to Canadian facilities near Lake Patricia, Alberta. It was isolated, cold, and perfect for secrecy. The Canadians, confused but compliant, called it the Ice Ship Project. There, amid snowdrifts and makeshift labs, the first full-size experiments began. Men mixed pulp and water in industrial blenders, poured it into wooden molds, and left it to freeze in the open air. The results were astonishing. The blocks resisted axes, bullets, even small explosions. But problems followed quickly. Maintaining temperature was almost impossible. A mild thaw caused the surface to melt and refreeze, warping the structure. When engineers suggested refrigeration, Pike insisted it was unnecessary. "The Arctic will do the work for us." He was brilliant, but impossible to manage. He fought with technicians, argued with officers, ignored safety protocols. He spoke of logistics, not limits. "We'll carve the hole directly out of ice," he said once. Think of it as a glacier under command. For a time, his confidence was contagious. Workers believed they were part of something extraordinary, a weapon that would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. But not everyone was convinced. Some saw Pike's creation as a miracle. Others saw it as madness wearing a uniform. Either way, by the spring of 1943, the world's first ice warship had begun to take shape, hidden in the frozen silence of Canada. When Winston Churchill read the memo, he didn't laugh. He rarely did when something was labeled impossible. His pencil hovered above the page for a few seconds before he scrawled 3 words across the margin: "Make it happen." That was all Mountbatten needed. The Prime Minister's note turned an eccentric theory into official policy. Within days, the codename Habakkuk was assigned. The files stamped most secret, and Pike was ordered to report directly to the Chiefs of Staff Committee. The project now had resources, but it also had enemies. The Admiralty didn't like it. Senior officers thought it was a waste of time and money. To them, Pike was a lunatic, meddling in military matters he couldn't possibly understand. The Navy trusted steel, not sawdust. One admiral reportedly muttered, "If Churchill wants a ship made of ice, perhaps he should sail it himself." But no one dared oppose Mountbatten openly. He was young, well-connected, and ruthless in his pursuit of innovation. He believed in the project, or at least in the idea of it, and Churchill's order made belief mandatory. By February 1943, plans were already underway to build a small-scale prototype. London was too warm, too crowded, too visible, so Mountbatten arranged for the work to be done in Canada, far from German bombers and prying eyes. A site was chosen near Lake Patricia, deep in Alberta's wilderness. It was remote, frozen, and empty, the perfect laboratory for something the world wasn't meant to see. Pike arrived first. He hated the cold, but he loved the isolation. To him, this was freedom. No Admiralty committees, no doubters, no interruptions. Just snow, machinery, and his strange new material. He wrote to Mountbatten from the field. "Conditions ideal. Pykrete performs beyond expectation. Requires refrigeration control, but resilience remarkable. Morale high." The Canadian engineers who joined the effort weren't sure what to make of him. He dressed like a wanderer, slept in his clothes, and carried notebooks filled with chaotic calculations. He would stop mid-sentence, stare into space, then jot something down furiously. No one knew whether to salute him or keep their distance. Work began in March. The first task was simple: build a floating platform to test the theory.
They cleared a frozen patch of the lake and began pouring mixture into wooden molds. Each block was enormous, over 6 meters long, weighing several tons. Frozen in layers, compacted with pulp, then lifted and joined by steel bolts. Within a month, the prototype stood, an 18-meter raft of ice and fiber anchored in the middle of the lake. From a distance, it looked like any other slab of frozen water, but when the engineers fired small arms at it, the bullets ricocheted. When they struck it with an axe, it barely dented. Pike stood by, face half frozen, grinning through exhaustion. You see, nature is the strongest engineer of all. But behind the triumph, cracks were forming, literal and political. The prototype began to melt around the edges as temperatures rose. Without constant refrigeration, the surface turned slushy. Technicians begged Pike to install chillers. He refused. "It will survive," he said. "Ice has memory. It wants to stay frozen." Back in London, reports began to circulate. The project was expensive, the materials unreliable, and the scientists uncooperative. One memo described Pike as brilliant but unstable. The Ministry of Supply wanted control. The Admiralty wanted out, and Mountbatten wanted results. In May 1943, Mountbatten flew to Canada himself. He wanted to see the miracle with his own eyes. When his plane touched down in Alberta, he was greeted by a handful of frostbitten engineers. They led him to the lake, where the raft sat glinting under the spring sun. It was smaller than he had imagined, but it held. Even as the ice around it cracked and melted, the pykrete core remained solid. Mountbatten had them fire a rifle into it. The bullet embedded halfway and stopped. Then he ordered a small charge placed at the corner. When it detonated, only a fist-sized crater appeared. He turned to his adjutant. "Tell London it works. We'll scale it up." That night, in his report to Churchill, he wrote, "Habakkuk shows promise. Recommend further development at full scale. Request 10,000 tons of wood pulp and 300,000 tons of ice." Pike read the cable and smiled. For the first time, it felt real. The impossible idea was no longer theory, it was official. But as the project grew, so did its enemies. The ice that could stop bullets might not stop bureaucracy. And Pike, the visionary who dreamed it all, was about to find that genius meant nothing once politics took hold.
The camp at Lake Patricia looked nothing like a shipyard. There were no cranes, no dry docks, no smell of oil, just snow, ice, and the low hum of diesel generators echoing through the trees. Workers called it the frozen factory. Every day began in darkness, every night ended the same. Men in thick coats mixed pulp and water in massive steel vats, the sound of slush and motors blending into a rhythm that never stopped. They weren't shipbuilders. They were farmers, carpenters, mechanics, anyone the government could spare. No one told them what they were building. They just followed the blueprints. Walls of ice, bolted plates, channels for cooling pipes. Mountbatten's staff kept a close eye on the work. Officially, the project didn't exist. Unofficially, it was consuming more men, machines, and money every week. The plan called for a prototype 60 meters long, only a fraction of the final design. But even this test platform pushed the limits of imagination. The core had to be refrigerated constantly, or it would sag under its own weight. The chillers ran day and night, powered by generators that froze solid every morning. By May, the structure rose like a glacier out of the lake. Thick walls, reinforced edges, a hollow interior where pipes hissed and valves clicked. Engineers moved across its icy decks with caution, the surface creaking beneath their boots. At night, they worked by the light of flood lamps, steam rising from their breath. The noise was constant, compressors whining, drills biting into frozen fiber. One officer wrote in his diary, "It feels less like construction and more like resurrection, as if we are building something nature never meant to exist." Pike patrolled the site like a restless ghost. He spoke to no one for long. He scribbled numbers in the snow, drew patterns on the ice, erased them, started again. When the engineers complained about cracks forming in the foundation, he brushed them off.
It's not failure, it's adjustment. They tested the structure every week. Small charges detonated along the sides. Bullets fired into the walls. The ice flexed, but held. Every report came back the same. Resilience, satisfactory. And yet something felt off. The heat from the machinery created a constant fog around the platform. The outer layers softened, turning slick under the men's boots. Water pooled at the edges, refreezing at night into jagged spikes. It looked less like a ship and more like a frozen beast struggling to breathe. Still, Mountbatten pushed forward. He sent back progress cables to London, filled with cautious optimism. Structure holding, temperature stable. Recommend expansion to 300 feet. Churchill replied with one line. Continue experiments. Inform me of results. Then came the inspection. A detachment from the Canadian Army arrived. Engineers, not soldiers. They were ordered to assess the feasibility of scaling up the structure to a full-sized carrier. Their verdict was uncertain. Yes, the material worked. Yes, it could resist gunfire. But the logistics were a nightmare. A ship of ice would require refrigeration across every meter of its hull. Thousands of tons of coolant, endless power, and maintenance crews working non-stop. One of the Canadians said quietly, "It's not a ship. It's a frozen city that has to fight the sun." Pike hated the report. He accused the officers of lacking imagination. He demanded they expand the facility instead of doubting it. Mountbatten sided with Pike, at least publicly. Privately, he began to wonder how long they could keep the project alive before it collapsed under its own ambition. Summer came early that year. Temperatures climbed. The ice sweated under the sun, dark streaks spreading across its surface. Fans and chillers ran at full power, burning through fuel faster than supplies could reach them. One morning, the night shift found a crack running across the main deck, 3 meters wide, jagged, black. By afternoon, it had grown deep enough to swallow a man's boot. They patched it with frozen pulp, but the fissures kept returning. When Mountbatten received the photographs, he knew what they meant. The ice ship could be built, but it could never last. Still, he refused to cancel it. He told his men, "We'll finish this model. Even if it melts, we'll know we did it." For Pike, that was enough. He worked until his hands bled from the cold. He believed that somewhere, somehow, the ocean could still be tamed by frozen steel and human stubbornness. By late summer, the frozen factory stood silent, engines off, tools abandoned. The last report read simply, "Prototype remains structurally intact, though deterioration observed, awaiting orders." No one knew it then, but those words marked the beginning of the end for Project Habakkuk. The ice had proven strong, but not strong enough to survive politics, cost, or the changing tide of war. The first full-scale tests began in December 1943. By then, the camp at Lake Patricia had turned into a fortress of snow. The trees around the lake stood heavy with frost, their branches like spears of glass. The ice groaned beneath every step, echoing through the valley like a warning. Inside the main hangar, the ship waited, a massive rectangular structure of frozen water and pulp, its walls 2 meters thick. From a distance, it looked solid, invincible. Up close, it was scarred and sweating. Engineers worked around the clock, logging temperature, stress, and fracture data. Each shift began the same way: a quick inspection of the cracks, a scrape of the ice, a report written in frozen ink. Frost clung to their eyebrows, their breath froze in their scarves. The structure's refrigeration system was the heart of the operation. Pipes carried brine through the walls, keeping the temperature below freezing. But the chillers weren't built for such extremes. Valves froze shut, compressors failed. When one broke, it took hours to replace. Hours the ice couldn't afford. One night, the chief mechanic, Sergeant John Haskins, recorded in his log, "Refrigeration down for 47 minutes, south wall temperature rising, cracks audible, pykrete holding, but barely." Pike refused to slow down. He was obsessed.
pacing the catwalks, muttering to himself about molecular balance and thermal fatigue. He told anyone who would listen that the project was still sound, that they were witnessing the growing pains of progress. But not everyone agreed. The Canadian officers overseeing the tests were losing faith. They respected Pike's intellect, but they also saw the truth. The structure was alive, and it was dying. On January 4th, temperatures spiked to -3 degrees Celsius, mild by northern standards, disastrous for Habakkuk. The refrigeration could no longer keep pace. Water pooled on the deck, the edges softened. When a team fired test rounds from a mounted Browning, the bullets didn't bounce this time, they sunk, leaving deep, wet craters. Haskins reported again, material integrity decreasing, recommend immediate reinforcement or termination. Pike dismissed the warning. He ordered more pulp, more freezing. His men shoveled sawdust into mixers until their hands blistered, trying to thicken the slush faster than it melted. The situation grew chaotic. Fuel for the generators was running low. The delivery trucks froze solid miles from camp. Even the guards had to burn scrap wood for heat. Still, the tests continued. On January 9th, the structure was subjected to a full-scale explosion test, a half-pound TNT charge placed against the outer wall. Observers huddled behind snowbanks as the fuse burned down. The blast rolled across the lake, snow leaping into the air. When the smoke cleared, the wall was still standing, cracked, yes, but intact. The pykrete had absorbed most of the force. Mountbatten's aide Commander Horn scribbled in his notebook, "Impact test successful. Structure resilient under moderate explosive stress." It was a victory, but a hollow one. The crack from the explosion didn't stop spreading. By nightfall, it ran the entire length of the hull. Inside, the brine system whined and gurgled, ice shifting like tectonic plates. One worker described it as listening to a frozen earthquake. By mid-January, Pike's obsession had reached its breaking point. He refused to leave the camp, sleeping beside the generators, eating ration biscuits frozen solid. When Mountbatten cabled from London asking for a progress report, Pike's reply was erratic, part data, part manifesto. Habakkuk remains viable. The material fights back, adapts. We are close to achieving stability. Ice is not weak, it is merely misunderstood. Mountbatten didn't know whether to be impressed or alarmed. He forwarded the report to Churchill with a simple note: "The inventor is losing touch." 2 days later, disaster struck. The refrigeration grid failed completely for 6 hours. When power returned, half the north wall had slumped into the lake. Chunks of frozen pulp drifted like miniature icebergs. The crew managed to stabilize what was left, but the damage was irreversible. The next morning, as Pike walked the perimeter, his boot went through a thin patch of ice. He didn't react, just stared into the dark water beneath him. For the first time, he said nothing. That same week, a team from the Canadian Army filed their final assessment. The document was brief, almost clinical. Habakkuk exhibits unique physical properties but remains impractical for sustained operations. Structural instability and maintenance requirements exceed feasible limits. Recommend immediate suspension. Mountbatten read the report twice. He didn't argue. He knew the project was finished. On February 2nd, 1944, the order came down from London. Project Habakkuk terminated. The generators were shut off. The refrigeration lines froze one last time. Within weeks, the prototype sagged, split, and sunk beneath the lake. When spring came, nothing remained except a few rusted bolts and the outlines of a dream that had melted back into the water.
When the order to terminate Project Habakkuk reached Lake Patricia, it felt less like an ending and more like an execution. The message was brief, signed by the Ministry of Supply, stamped "Top Secret, no further action required." Pike read it twice, then folded the paper neatly and slipped it into his coat. He didn't argue, he didn't shout. He simply walked out into the snow and kept walking until the lights of the camp disappeared behind him. By the time Mountbatten's men caught up,
He was sitting on a fallen tree, staring at the lake. The structure, once white and solid, was now a ruin of gray slush and fractured panels. Steam rose from the surface where generators still hissed faintly, fighting a war they'd already lost. Pike spoke quietly. They were afraid it would work. No one answered. Back in London, the reaction was different. Committees formed, memos circulated, files changed hands. No one wanted to admit responsibility for the cost or the failure. To the politicians, the ice ship had become an embarrassment, a symbol of desperation they preferred to forget. Reports were rewritten, figures adjusted. The Admiralty claimed the idea had been a theoretical exploration. The Ministry of Supply insisted it had been a materials test, not a weapons program. By the time the paperwork was finished, Habakkuk no longer existed, not even on paper. Mountbatten fought to preserve the record. He argued that the research could lead to new insulation techniques, new construction methods, even civilian applications. But his requests were ignored. The war had moved on. Steel was plentiful again. The Allies were winning. Churchill never mentioned the project publicly. Privately, he called it a bold but impractical notion, the right kind of madness at the wrong time. Pike returned to England in the spring of 1944. He was thinner, quieter, and somehow older. He brought with him a small box of samples, frozen fragments of pykrete sealed in wax. He kept them in his flat in Hampstead in a chest freezer he bought with his own money. To his friends, he spoke rarely of the project. When he did, he called it proof that ideas are stronger than armies. But the disappointment never left him. In June, D-Day began. Thousands of steel ships crossed the Channel, storming Normandy. The war machine had no need for frozen fortresses anymore. The headlines praised innovation and courage, but no one remembered the man who had tried to build an aircraft carrier out of ice. Then came the audits. The government wanted explanations, not of the science, but of the spending. Every project had to be justified, every penny traced. Pike became a convenient target. He was summoned to testify before a panel at Whitehall. The room was cold, bureaucratic, merciless. They asked him about budgets, refrigeration units, shipments of wood pulp. He tried to explain the science, the vision, the purpose. They interrupted him mid-sentence. "Mr. Pike, we are not interested in philosophy. Was the experiment a success or a failure?" He paused. "Neither," he said. "It was proof of what we're afraid to attempt." The committee ended the session early. After that, doors began to close. No more invitations to meetings, no more access to research councils. His files were quietly classified and shelved under obsolete projects, do not reopen. Mountbatten tried to protect him, but even his influence had limits. He wrote a final letter to Pike. "You were ahead of your time. The future will catch up, but the present is too busy surviving." Pike never replied. He spent the following year working on other proposals, ideas for mobile hospitals, solar heating, and modular shelters for refugees. Brilliant, practical, ignored. By the time the war ended in 1945, Habakkuk was a ghost. The camp at Lake Patricia was dismantled, its remains buried beneath the thaw. Only a few photographs survived, grainy black and white shots of men standing on an endless sheet of ice. No captions, no context. Years later, locals claimed that pieces of the structure still lay at the bottom of the lake, a skeleton of frozen ambition preserved in silence. Divers found bolts, fragments of pipe, a few warped panels of what might have been pykrete. The rest had melted into history. For Geoffrey Pike, the project's death marked the beginning of his own decline. He withdrew from public life, his notebooks growing stranger, filled with sketches of machines that ran on sunlight and wind. He still believed humanity could build miracles, if only it stopped fearing the impossible. But the world had moved on. By the time anyone remembered his name, he was gone, another casualty of a war fought as much in laboratories as on battlefields.
By 1945, the war was almost over. The seas that had once devoured convoys now carried victory fleets. Germany's U-boats were silent, rusting at their piers or lying cold on the ocean floor. No one spoke of Habakkuk anymore. Its reports had been sealed, its engineers reassigned. Even the camp at Lake Patricia had been wiped from official records. But for those who had been there, for the men who had felt the ice tremble beneath their boots, the memory lingered. It was the memory of something that should not have existed, yet somehow had. When Pike returned to London, the city was gray and rebuilt in patches. Children played where craters once smoked. Newspapers spoke of peace, prosperity, the atomic age. The future had arrived, clean, metallic, and bright. There was no place in it for frozen dreams. He tried to move on. He gave lectures no one attended, wrote essays no one published. In one of his notebooks, found years later, a line stood out. The world prefers the possible. It is safer that way. Mountbatten was promoted, knighted, remembered as a visionary. Churchill wrote his memoirs and mentioned Pike only once, briefly, as a man of curious genius whose ideas were, perhaps, too advanced for the times. The ice ship, his masterpiece, had melted into legend. But the story didn't end at Lake Patricia. In the years that followed, whispers of Habakkuk appeared in obscure engineering journals. A few scientists tried to recreate pykrete in laboratories. They confirmed what he had claimed. The material was real. It could still stop bullets. It could still float. But no one could find a reason to use it anymore. The world had discovered other miracles. Jets, nuclear power, plastic, steel. Cold had no place in a future that burned with speed and light. In 1950, Pike was found dead in his flat in Hampstead. A heart attack, they said. On his desk lay a stack of papers, diagrams, formulas, half-written letters. One was addressed to no one. Ice remembers everything it touches. It keeps the shape of what it was made for. So do men. We freeze our hopes inside us until they melt away. It was the last thing he ever wrote. After his death, his name vanished again, filed under miscellaneous inventors in the archives of wartime research. But the legend of Habakkuk refused to die completely. In 1970, a group of divers exploring Lake Patricia found something beneath the silt, a wall of frozen wood pulp, still intact. They took samples. The structure hadn't melted at all. The cold, dark water had preserved it, like a time capsule of a forgotten dream. For a brief moment, newspapers ran the story, remains of Britain's ice ship found in Canada. Readers dismissed it as rumor. But for those who remembered the project, it was vindication. A ghost rising through the decades, whispering that the impossible had almost worked. One of the original engineers, by then an old man, gave a rare interview. He spoke slowly, voice trembling. People think it failed, but we built it. We stood on it. We fired at it. It held. For a moment, the ocean belonged to ice. That was the truth no report could bury. Habakkuk hadn't failed because the science was wrong. It failed because the war changed, and with it, the world's patience for ideas that didn't fit the schedule of victory. History would call it a curiosity, a footnote. But in the archives of invention, in the long list of things that almost were, Habakkuk stands as a monument to the thin line between madness and genius. And somewhere beneath a quiet Canadian lake, that monument still exists, a frozen cathedral of pulp and ice, waiting in the dark. In winter, when the temperature drops low enough, locals say the lake sings, a deep,
haunting groan that rolls under the ice, like a memory trying to rise to the surface. No one knows if it's the wind, the pressure, or something older. But if you listen closely, it almost sounds like steel bending, like generators starting, like a man whispering to himself in the dark, "It will hold, just give it time."